Hello, everyone. I am Pepe Zen, Associate Director and Fellow of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and welcome to today's Experts of the Americas interview. Today, I'm just so delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Helga Flores Trejo, Vice President and Head of International Public Affairs at Bayer. Helga, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pepe, it is a great pleasure.
Thank you so much. And before we start, let me just say a couple quick words on the context for this interview. You know, the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center, we focus on Latin America and the Caribbean's strategic role in the global context, and always with a priority on the focusing economic and political issues that will shape the region's trajectory, not only now, but in the years ahead. And in this moment, we continue committed to helping the region to use the COVID-19 pandemic as an inflection point for leapfrogging economic development. As part of this work, as part of this process, we have partnered up with the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, to help everyone better understand the opportunities and the challenges that critically the private sector sees in our region. And as well, you know, the critical role that the private sector itself can play and can continue to play in supporting economic recovery and also long-term prosperity in Latin America and the Caribbean. So today's interview is part of a conversation series with Latin American Caribbean private sector leaders on these topics. Insights from this interview and other interviews will provide input for a forthcoming Atlantic Council IDB report. And today we'll focus on Bayer's perspective and the broader pharmaceutical, food, and other related space. And once again, Helga, it's such a great pleasure to have you with us. And we'll begin with my first question. And this question is about Latin America and the Caribbean. Companies like Bayer, you guys have strong international presence across all different geographies, including Latin America and the Caribbean. If I'm not mistaken, 120 years. So think about that 120-year presence in the region, that commitment to Latin America and the Caribbean. What are some unique factors that make this region such an important market for you, especially when compared to other regions?
Pepe, thank you so much indeed. And let me say, Bayer, of course, is a leading company in pharmaceuticals and leading in agricultural seeds and inputs and technology. Now, in Latin America, you said the decisive word. We have had an absolutely long-term commitment. We are with the region. So in Mexico, for example, we just celebrated our 100th anniversary. In others, we've been in different years. So we have been there. When you ask what makes it attractive, let me highlight three factors. One, definitely the level of education of its people. Second, as a key agricultural company, the productivity of its land. And third, if I could say really in general, the abundance of its natural resources makes it a tremendously attractive region. Let me give you an example in the area of agriculture. It is well known that Latin America is really a food superpower, right? We have Brazil and Argentina among the top 5 exporters of soybean, of wheat, of corn. In these days, precisely when we are talking so much about the importance on food and the lack of it and the challenges of getting food everywhere it needs to go, makes it even more strategic, this capacity of Latin America to feed the world itself and the world. Just recently, to talk a little bit about the pharmaceuticals, we are very excited because we made a large investment in Costa Rica, 200 million for a production site for long-term contraceptives. And this site will start producing in 2024. It is essential. Why? Because worldwide, there is millions and millions of people that would like to have, of women, not people, of women that would like to have access to modern contraceptives, and they don't. So this site in Costa Rica will help again provide women all over the world with this essential medicine.
Thank you so much, Helga. That was very, very helpful. And just let me applaud once again Bayer's leadership across these different sectors, whether that's pharmaceutical, food, and agriculture. And on the agriculture point, let me pick up on that because we fully agree on the potential of Latin America and the Caribbean as a global agricultural powerhouse. In the meantime, though, this is kind of an interesting contradiction because we live in a world where, due partially to, I would say, shortages and also, rising prices in the food sector, hunger continues to be a very critical issue for many different regions in the world. If I'm not mistaken, I recently read that, Bayer recently made a 160 million commitment to Zero Hunger Pledge, which covers across different regions, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, by 2020. So think about hunger and perhaps some of the other challenges that's facing our region, Latin America and the Caribbean. If I have to put you on a spot here and ask you to highlight one or maybe two key social economic challenges in the region that you see the region is facing, what would that be? And critically, how is Bayer, helping to address that one or two challenge?
Pepe, I'll highlight three if you allow, but I'll do it shortly because they're essential. First, I believe it is not highlighted enough, women's health. Investing in women's health is a tremendous essential factor, not only economically, but socially too. Unfortunately, in Latin America, we have in total 15% of all pregnancies are of girls under 18, and the trend is that it goes to girls under 14. This is something that we need to address, that governments need to address, and giving women the access to family planning will allow them to integrate in the jobs market, but also really take care of their family. Second, I think probably not seen enough. We all have been living with COVID, and that's pandemics are in our minds, absolutely clear. Unfortunately, non-communicable diseases are even worse than pandemics. And this is an area where, unfortunately, also in Latin America, probably we have in the whole region, more than 10 million people that die prematurely from non-communicable diseases. And to speak very clearly, what are those? Cardiovascular diseases, diabetes diseases. This is, again, an area to tap into the future development of Latin America, we need to tackle. And third, I cannot, stop mentioning it. It is climate change, right? If you look at the effects of La Nina in the past 2 years, La Nina has effects globally, but certainly for Latin America, it has meant 2 years of tremendous and historical droughts. They have, led to reduction of production and yields in Argentina and Brazil that is extremely significant. So for all of three, women's health and access to reproductive, to family planning. Second, for non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular diseases. And third, for coping with climate without losing our productivity. We are working towards that, but I believe these are three essential targets that Latin America needs to keep in mind to really develop its potential.
Thank you so much for that. I think that was absolutely spot on. Let me just quickly comment that on women's health, absolutely agree, critical issue in the region. And in your response to the first question, I think that example in Costa Rica, the investment and commitment that Bayer is making is critical there. Second, on non-communicable diseases from the Atlantic Council, we've been doing a lot of work there. And two quick points I'll make is, one is, those who are vulnerable to non-communicable diseases, these are also the ones that are extremely vulnerable to COVID-19. They're the high-risk group, something that we've been thinking about. And second, because there's been so much focus on the pandemic itself, which is obviously well justified, something we've seen is a disruption to normal, regular health services that deeply impacted folks that are vulnerable to non-communicable diseases. So can't agree more on the importance of not just doing well, but also catching up in that sense, recovering from the pandemic. And third and finally, climate change. It just impacts our region so significantly. Love to be able to get into more some of that if we have the time later. But one thing I've been thinking about is based on some of the three challenges you mentioned, you see, which once again, I think is absolutely spot on. It's very difficult for any entity, whether that's private sector, whether that's government, whether that's a multilateral organization such as the IDB, to be tackling any of these challenges on their own. I think partnerships are absolutely important. So on that note, let me ask you a question about partnerships and about how different sectors can collaborate. One example I read in this space is Bayer actually joined the IDB and several other companies in this partnership to support Latin America and the Caribbean's recovery. Love to hear more about that. And this partnership covers different programs, empowering women, which we talked a little about today. Digitization is a key element of that. strengthening regional value chains, among other things. But the question here is, how can the public sector and multilateral organizations like the IDB, for example, help make Latin America and the Caribbean more business and investment friendly for multinational companies like Bayer and similar companies? And how can partnerships play a role in supporting regional economy and making sure that we have more sustainable, more robust growth trajectory going forward?
Indeed, I could not stress more, partnerships are essential. We won't tackle any of these alone, and we won't be fast enough as we need to be. So what's interesting, if I look at exactly IDB that you mentioned in the partnership, in Bayer, we actually have a dedicated area that I lead in my team, dedicated to partner with international financial institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank and with UN agencies and others. The objective is clear. How do we tackle the Sustainable Development Goals and reach them faster together? So we're looking always for ways to common goals and ways to work towards achieving them. When we look at the international organizations, I know that there's always doubts how effective, how fast, how uncomplicated they might be or not. The truth is they are essential. Why? They have the complete presence in the region. They have the credibility. They have the long-term experience. And for me, something that is extremely important, at the end, international institutions like the IDB and others shape the policy environment we work in. So that win-win combination of us bringing expertise, investments, and international organizations bringing their know-how, their policy shaping capacities, the collaboration and capacities to convene the government are key. Let me give you one example, which I think it is underestimated, because we all can do tremendous good projects individually. But one of the challenges we have to scale up projects is the question of who helps communicate the lessons learned. Who is able to take whatever worked in one region to take it to another and reduce the time we test, etc. So I have examples, right? You know, if international organizations like IDB and others can help, for example, the way Brazil and Argentina have state-of-the-art regulation of gene editing, which I think is essential to tackle the food crisis and to feed 8 billion people in the world. Costa Rica has tremendous success in and know-how in attracting foreign direct investment. So if you look at those successes in Latin America and help take it to other countries and learn from there, it's not one-to-one, but learning from what others are doing well, it's of course essential. And I think here, that's why partnerships are very, can be very productive and really key.
And certainly we are, and our partners at the Inter-American Development Bank and other multilateral organizations are taking notes. Great to hear your perspective on this, Helga. It's absolutely agreed that, you know, the cross-pollination and exchange of best practices, know-hows, and knowledge is critical for scaling and achieving optimal results faster. Let me switch gear a little bit and ask you a question more on the business side. You know, we talked a lot about, you know, the social aspect and other social economic aspect of the things, the challenges, opportunities we see in the region, what Bayer has been doing in this space. But this business side question is more about how Bayer is dealing with the tremendous changing that we were seeing and we're living through in this evolving world, especially through the pandemic. Like we've seen business models, customer needs just evolving completely. And we can talk about digitization, we can talk about supply chains, we can talk about access to health and medicine. All of these could potentially have long-term implications and many others. So what are some of these changes and how is Bayer adapting some of these changes in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean?
Yeah, I mean, definitely right with COVID. I had just joined, I was 5 days in the office, having joined Bayer 5 days only when COVID hit and we were sent home. I think the first thing you saw companies really done immediately is, okay, you have to deal first with your employees, right? We have 100,000 employees all over the world. In Latin America alone, it's 14,000 employees. So the first reaction is for the company and for everybody working within, make sure that the family buyer and people in our network are doing well. In terms of the disruptions we saw, we have an interesting perspective, because yes, the pharmaceutical supply chain was tremendously challenged, right? We need masks to produce many of our products in Latin and production sites we have in Latin America, for example, but you couldn't export masks from one place to the other. So those are lessons to learn also. But I have to also highlight that if you look at the food supply chain, it actually was extremely resilient during COVID. You were able, even locally sometimes, companies and others were acting to help with transport and access, but all in all, the supply of food was continued without too many troubles. I think in general, one of the things two things it accelerated. Probably it not completely changed, but it accelerated. One, digital transformation, essential, right? Also in agriculture, also in telehealth, or in the service. We're not direct in the providing of service, but we also look at how the health system in general is improving. And digitalization of agriculture, for example, I think you will only see we putting a lot of effort and others into it. But second, coming back as how we approach things, I think the thinking that you partner with others along the value chain, and we have been working in the past with different actors along the value chain, and we call them the food chain partnerships, because it allows you, when you have a collective goal, to share insights, share resources, and really coordinate, which many cases was key for the one of the keys for the disruption, right? When individual countries or companies act individually instead of coordinated and together. So those are, I think, some of the changes I see.
Thank you for that. I particularly love that last point about, if I can call it, the whole of ecosystem approach, maybe to empowering different players throughout the value chain and making sure that we're achieving optimal results. And obviously, in doing so, this creates greater benefits for all the players within the ecosystem. So very appreciate your insight on that. In the interest of time, let me perhaps just ask you one final question, and this one focusing on health. You mentioned, for example, earlier in the response to your last question, telehealth, the critical nature and the importance of digitization and all the things that are happening in the health space during the pandemic. And the question here is, how does building or expanding on health infrastructure, however you define that, and pandemic preparedness fit into your company's priorities in Latin America and the Caribbean, given we have recently been through, given your comparative strength?
So, I mean, certainly if I can come back, our largest investment recently was in Costa Rica, right? As a hub with those 200 million investment. In general, if you look at the revolution and the tremendous opportunities behind the biotech, what we call the bio revolution, that the vaccines showed with CRISPR and gene editing. We are only accelerating the knowledge, the research. I mean, we invest, it's unbelievable, but over 6 billion a year in research and development. There's no other companies that invest so much. Why? Because this is going to be decisive in the future. The opportunity to think that you could tackle diseases in a completely different way, cancer and others. So we're looking to that. In general, I know we are pressed for times. For Latin America, let me just say, as you said at the beginning, for tackling these challenges we spoke about in the last 20 minutes, it takes long-term commitment. And we have not talked about, we have shown that in good and less good times, that Bayer has been in the region and is committed to the region. It's a region of great opportunities where we can do lots together. And so you see definitely the Bayer commitment to Latin America and the Caribbean very strongly, and to the Americas in general, right?
Thank you so much for reaffirming that. I like how we started off the conversation and closing out the conversation in a similar manner, talking about the importance of commitment on expanding some of the health and among other infrastructure and issues for the region. And with that, we'll wrap. And Helga, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And once again, thank you everyone else for following this conversation. Helga, will welcome you back at some point in the future to have a follow-up conversation about these critical issues for the region. And thank you again. Helga was Vice President and Head of International Public Affairs at Bayer. Thank you, Helga.
Thanks so much.